Rapunzel. Once upon a time there was a woodcutter and his wife, who lived in a small house high on a hill. The house overlooked a vast, dark forest, and at the edge of the forest lived an enchantress, who had great power and was feared by everyone in the kingdom. The enchantress had a beautiful garden, full of sweet-smelling flowers and herbs. The woodcutter's wife would often stand on the hill and look down at the garden with envy. Nothing would grow on the hill where she lived. The earth was hard and stony. The wife wished that she could have a beautiful, sweet-smelling garden just like the enchantress. One day the wife was looking down into the garden when she spotted a row of tall plants with wide leaves and purple flowers. "Rampion!" she gasped. "Oh, how their sweet roots would taste delicious with some vinegar and pepper." Her mouth was watering at the thought. But there was no way the nasty enchantress would ever share the delicious rampion with her. "What are you looking at?" asked the woodcutter one day. His wife replied, "Look there, those rampions in the garden. For days I have desired them. Please, ask the enchantress if she would give me some." The woodcutter shook his head and laughed. "I hear the last person who went to see the enchantress was turned into a toad. You won't see me going anywhere near her front door." The wife grew miserable. Her simple meals of porridge and thin, watery stew just weren't the same. She wanted more. "If you really loved me," said the wife to her husband, "you would go to the garden and get me some of that sweet-tasting rampion. The enchantress will never spot that some of it have gone missing, and I will be able to make us a delicious supper." The woodcutter's belly rumbled at the thought. He was frightened of the enchantress and her great power. But perhaps if he stole the rampion at night no one would notice. And that is exactly what he did. At midnight he climbed over the low wall into the garden. Grabbing hold of the leafy stalks, he began pulling up the rampion from their earthy bed. He licked his lips when he saw the thick, white roots that would taste so good with some vinegar and pepper. "Thief!" shrieked a voice that made the woodcutter jump. He dropped the rampion and turned to see the enchantress watching him, her arms folded across her chest. "How dare you steal from my garden? Please," begged the woodcutter, "don't turn me into a toad. My wife saw the rampion growing in your garden and has longed for it ever since. Nothing will grow on our hard, stony hill. Please, forgive me." The enchantress nodded, her scowl turning to a sly smile. "You are forgiven. Take as much of the rampion as you can carry." The woodcutter's eyes almost popped out of his head. "As much as I can carry?" he gasped. "Yes," snapped the enchantress. "But on one condition. You must give me the child that your wife will bring into the world. It will be well treated and I will care for it like a mother." The woodcutter was so afraid that he nodded in agreement. "Yes, yes, I promise," he croaked, rapidly stuffing the rampion into a cloth sack. He just wanted to get as far away from the scary enchantress as he could. And so, the wife got her rampion and it tasted even better than she had imagined. Days turned into weeks and weeks became months. As the winter snows began to fall, the wife gave birth to a baby girl with big blue eyes and tufty blonde hair. She named the girl Rapunzel. The couple was delighted, but their joy was to be short-lived. Keeping to her bargain, the enchantress came to the house and took the baby away. The woodcutter and his wife were heartbroken, but they knew they could never go back on the promise. In time, Rapunzel grew into a beautiful young woman. She lived in the house on the edge of the forest, with only the enchantress for the company. She often looked out of her window and wondered who lived in the small house, perched on the hill. One day, Rapunzel asked if she could go and visit. The enchantress was angry and took her deep into the forest instead. There, Rapunzel was shut away in a tall dark tower that had neither stairs nor door, just a narrow little window for Rapunzel to look out of. "You will stay here," commanded the enchantress. "When I want to visit I will call, 'Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair,' and you will do as I ask." Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, as fine as spun gold. Whenever she heard the voice of the enchantress she would let down her braided hair and the enchantress would climb up it to reach the window. She would bring Rapunzel bread and water, but no comfort or love. One day, the king's son was riding through the forest. He stopped when he caught the sound of a voice raised in song. It was coming from an area of the forest he had never been to before. He dismounted and led his horse between the dark trees. Following the beautiful song, he emerged into a clearing. At its center was the tall stone tower. Rapunzel was leaning out of the narrow window, singing a sad melody softly to herself. On seeing her beauty, the prince immediately fell in love with her. "Who are you?" he called. But Rapunzel did not answer. She was afraid that the enchantress would punish her if she spoke to a stranger. The prince looked for a door to enter the tower, but there was nothing, just cold, dark stone. Scratching his head, he backed away from the tower. "This is a very strange puzzle," he declared. "I can't see how I can climb up to that window. It is far too high." At that moment he heard the crunch of leaves. Leading his horse behind a tree, the prince hid from view, just as the evil enchantress stepped from the forest. "Rapunzel, Rapunzel," she called. "Let down your hair." Immediately, Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair. The witch climbed up to her and disappeared into the tower. The prince waited patiently until the enchantress reappeared and climbed back down again. "Aha," thought the prince. "So that is how I will reach my heart's desire." Once the enchantress had vanished into the forest, he walked up to the tower and called, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Immediately the hair was lowered. With a smile, the prince climbed the tower. When he reached the window, Rapunzel gave a shriek. She was expecting the enchantress, not a young handsome man. "Rapunzel," he said, falling to his knees. "Please let me take you far away from this horrible tower. Let me be your husband and love you for as long as I live." Rapunzel had never heard such kind and tender words before. She lost her fear and burst into tears. "Yes, please, please take me away, far, far away." But there was a problem. "How will I ever get down from this tower?" sobbed Rapunzel. "You can climb down my hair, but I cannot follow." The prince comforted her. "There must be a way." Rapunzel suddenly gave a gasp. "Wait, I have an idea. Bring me some silk and I will weave a ladder with it. When it is ready, I will be able to climb down from this horrible tower. Then we can both ride away from here, far, far away." The prince leaned forward and kissed Rapunzel on the cheek. "I will do as you ask. Do not despair. Soon you will be free." "Oh, thank you, brave prince." Rapunzel lowered her hair and watched as he climbed back down. Mounting his horse, the prince set off for home. He did not see the enchantress watching him from the shadows. Angrily, she marched up to Rapunzel's tower and shrieked at the top of her voice, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Too afraid to do otherwise, Rapunzel lowered her plaited hair. The enchantress climbed up, and when she reached the tower's room, she cut off Rapunzel's hair with a swish of her knife. "Wicked child! You have deceived me and now you will be punished," Rapunzel begged and pleaded, but the enchantress was too angry to listen. "I will banish you to the desert where no one is foolish enough to tread. There you will live, all alone, under the baking hot sun." With a wave of her hands, the enchantress cast a spell. Rapunzel vanished in the blink of an eye. All that was left of her was the golden braids, lying on the floor. The enchantress snatched them up. "Now I will teach that lovesick prince a lesson." At dawn the next morning, the prince arrived at the tower with a bundle of silk. "Rapunzel, Rapunzel," he called. "Let down your hair." The golden braids fell down from the window. Eagerly, the prince clambered up to the tower window. However, instead of the fair Rapunzel, he was met by the evil grin of the nasty enchantress. She had used Rapunzel's hair to trick him. "Fool!" she mocked. "The bird you seek no longer sits in the nest. Rapunzel is lost to you. You will never see her again." The prince's heart broke in two. "My love is gone, and now I have nothing to live for." With a cry of despair, he threw himself from the tower window. The enchantress cackled with glee. "Dear prince, you should look before you leap." With a click of her fingers, a tangled wall of thorns sprang up around the base of the tower. The prince fell into the cruel barbs and was lost from sight. The enchantress assumed that the prince was dead, and so failed to notice him clambering out of the thorns, his clothes ragged and torn. He had survived the gruesome trap, but his eyes had been pierced by the wicked thorns. He was blind. For months he wandered the land, calling Rapunzel's name. At length he came to the desert and began to cross its blistering hot sands. It was then that he heard the voice that was familiar to him, singing a sad lullaby. Filled with hope, the prince pressed onwards, following the sound. It led him to a cool, dark cave where Rapunzel was waiting. On seeing the prince, she ran into his arms weeping. The moment her sparkling tears touched his eyes, the prince's vision cleared. "I can see," he declared happily. Overcome with joy, the prince led Rapunzel out of the barren, hot desert. Together they traveled to his father's castle where they lived happily ever after. The end. Beauty and the Beast. Once upon a time, in a far-off country, there lived a merchant who had been so fortunate in all his undertakings that he was enormously rich. As he had 6 sons and 6 daughters, however, who were accustomed to having everything they fancied, he did not find he had a penny too much. But misfortunes befell them. One day their house caught fire and speedily burned to the ground, with all the splendid furniture, books, pictures, gold, silver, and precious goods it contained. The father suddenly lost every ship he had upon the sea, either by dint of pirates, shipwreck, or fire. Then he heard that his clerks in distant countries, whom he had trusted entirely, had proved unfaithful. And at last, from great wealth, he fell into the direst poverty. All that he had left was a little house in a desolate place at least 100 leagues from the town, and to this, he was forced to retreat. His children were in despair at the idea of leading such a different life. The daughters at first hoped their friends, who had been so numerous while they were rich, would insist on their staying in their houses, but they soon found they were left alone. Their former friends even attributed their misfortunes to their own extravagance and showed no intention of offering them any help. So nothing was left for them but to take their departure to the cottage, which stood in the midst of a dark forest and seemed to be the most dismal place on the face of the earth. As they were too poor to have any servants, the girls had to work hard, and the sons, for their part, cultivated the fields to earn their living. Roughly clothed and living in the simplest way, the girls regretted unceasingly the luxuries and amusements of their former life. Only the youngest daughter tried to be brave and cheerful. She had been as sad as anyone when misfortune first overtook her father, but soon recovering her natural gaiety, she set to work to make the best of things, to amuse her father and brothers as well as she could, and to persuade her sisters to join her in dancing and singing. But they would do nothing of the sort, and because she was not as doleful as themselves, they declared this miserable life was all she was fit for. But she was really far prettier and cleverer than they were. Indeed, She was so lovely she was always called Beauty. After 2 years, when they were all beginning to get used to their new life, their father received news that one of his ships, which he had believed lost, had come safely into port with a rich cargo. All the sons and daughters at once thought that their poverty was at an end and wanted to set out directly for the town. But their father, who was more prudent, begged them to wait for a little, and though it was harvest time, and he could ill be spared, determined to go himself to make inquiries. Only the youngest daughter had any doubt but that they would soon again be as rich as they were before. They all loaded their father with commissions for jewels and dresses which it would have taken a fortune to buy. Only Beauty, feeling sure that it was of no use, did not ask for anything. Her father, noticing her silence, said, "And what shall I bring for you, Beauty?" "The only thing I wish for is to see you come home safely," she answered. But this reply vexed her sisters, who fancied she was blaming them for having asked for such costly things. Her father, however, was pleased, but as he thought that at her age she certainly ought to like pretty presents, he told her to choose something. "Well, dear father," she said, "as you insist upon it, I beg that you will bring me a rose. I have not seen one since we came here, and I love them so much." The merchant reached town as quickly as possible, only to find that his former companions, believing him to be dead, had divided his cargo between them. After 6 months of trouble and expense, he found himself as poor as when he started on his journey. To make matters worse, he was obliged to return in the most terrible weather. By the time he was within a few leagues of his home, he was almost exhausted with cold and fatigue. Though he knew it would take some hours to get through the forest, he resolved to go on. But night overtook him, and the deep snow and bitter frost made it impossible for his horse to carry him any farther. Not a house was to be seen. The only shelter he could get was the hollow trunk of a great tree, and there he crouched all night, which seemed to him the longest he had ever known. The howling of the wolves kept him awake, and when at last day broke, the falling snow had covered up every path, and he did not know which way to turn. At length, he made out some sort of path, but it was so rough and slippery that he fell down more than once. Presently it led him into an avenue of trees that ended in a splendid castle. It seemed to the merchant very strange that no snow had fallen in the avenue of orange trees, covered with flowers and fruit. When he reached the first court of the castle, he saw before him a flight of agate steps. He went up to them and passed through several splendidly furnished rooms. The pleasant warmth of the air revived him, and he felt very hungry, but there seemed to be nobody in all this vast and splendid palace. Deep silence reigned everywhere, and at last, tired of roaming through empty rooms and galleries, he stopped in a room smaller than the rest, where a clear fire was burning, and a couch was drawn up cozily before it. Thinking this must be prepared for someone who was expected, He sat down to wait till he should come and very soon fell into a sweet sleep. When his extreme hunger wakened him after several hours, he was still alone. But a little table, with a good dinner on it, had been drawn up close to him. He lost no time in beginning his meal, hoping he might soon thank his considerate host, whoever it might be. But no one appeared, and even after another long sleep, from which he awoke completely refreshed, there was no sign of anybody, though a fresh meal of dainty cakes and fruit was prepared upon the little table at his elbow. Because he was naturally timid, the silence began to terrify him, and he resolved to search once more through all the rooms. But it was of no use. There was no sign of life in the palace. He wondered what he should do. To amuse himself, he began pretending that all the treasures he saw were his own and considering how he would divide them among his children. Then he went down into the garden, and though it was winter everywhere else, here the sun shone, the birds sang, the flowers bloomed, and the air was soft and sweet. The merchant, in ecstasies with all he saw and heard, said to himself, "All this must be meant for me. I will go this minute and bring my children to share all these delights." In spite of being so cold and weary when he reached the castle, he had taken his horse to the stable and fed it. Now he thought he would saddle it for his homeward journey, and he turned down the path which led to the stable. This path had a hedge of roses on each side of it, and the merchant thought he had never seen such exquisite flowers. They reminded him of his promise to Beauty, and he stopped and had just gathered one to take to her when he was startled by a strange noise behind him. Turning around, he saw a frightful beast, which seemed to be very angry and said in a terrible voice, "Who told you you might gather my roses? Was it not enough that I sheltered you in my palace and was kind to you? This is the way you show your gratitude, by stealing my flowers. But your insolence shall not go unpunished." The merchant, terrified by these furious words, dropped the fatal rose and, throwing himself on his knees, cried, "Pardon me, noble sir. I am truly grateful for your hospitality, which was so magnificent I could not imagine you would be offended by my taking such a little thing as a rose." But the beast's anger was not lessened by his speech. "You are very ready with excuses and flattery," he cried. "But that will not save you from the death you deserve." "Alas," thought the merchant, "if my daughter Beauty could only know into what danger her rose has brought me." And in despair he began to tell the beast all his misfortunes and the reason for his journey, not forgetting to mention Beauty's request. "A king's ransom would hardly have procured all that my other daughters asked for," he said. "But I thought I might at least take Beauty her rose. I beg you to forgive me, for you see I meant no harm." The beast said, in a less furious tone, "I will forgive you on one condition, that you will give me one of your daughters." "Ah!" cried the merchant, "if I were cruel enough to buy my own life at the expense of one of my children's, What excuse could I invent to bring her here? None, answered the beast. If she comes at all, she must come willingly. On no other condition will I have her. See if any one of them is courageous enough and loves you enough to come and save your life. You seem to be an honest man, so I will trust you to go home. I give you a month to see if any of your daughters will come back with you and stay here, to let you go free. If none of them is willing, you must come alone, after bidding them goodbye forever, for then you will belong to me. And do not imagine that you can hide from me. For if you fail to keep your word, I will come and fetch you," added the beast grimly. The merchant accepted this proposal, though he did not really think that any of his daughters would be persuaded to come. He promised to return at the time appointed, and then, anxious to escape from the presence of the beast, he asked permission to set off at once. But the beast answered that he could not go until the next day. "Then you will find a horse ready for you," he said. "Now go and eat your supper and await my orders." The poor merchant, more dead than alive, went back to his room, where the most delicious supper was already served on the little table drawn up before a blazing fire. But he was too terrified to eat and only tasted a few of the dishes, for fear the beast should be angry if he did not obey his orders. When he had finished, he heard a great noise in the next room, which he knew meant that the beast was coming. As he could do nothing to escape his visit, the only thing that remained was to seem as little afraid as possible. So when the beast appeared and asked roughly if he had souped well, the merchant answered humbly that he had, thanks to his host's kindness. Then the beast warned him to remember their agreement and to prepare his daughter exactly for what she had to expect. "Do not get up tomorrow," he added, "until you see the sun and hear a golden bell ring. Then you will find your breakfast waiting for you, and the horse you are to ride will be ready in the courtyard. He will also bring you back again when you come with your daughter a month hence. Farewell. Take a rose to beauty, and remember your promise." The merchant lay down until the sun rose. Then, after breakfast, he went to gather Beauty's rose and mounted his horse, which carried him off so swiftly that in an instant he had lost sight of the palace. He was still wrapped in gloomy thoughts when the horse stopped before the door of his cottage. His sons and daughters, who had been uneasy at his long absence, rushed to meet him, eager to know the result of his journey, which, seeing him mounted upon a splendid horse and wrapped in a rich mantle, they supposed to be favorable. But he hid the truth from them at first, only saying sadly to Beauty as he gave her the rose, "Here is what you asked me to bring you. Little you know what it has cost." But this excited their curiosity so greatly that presently he told them his adventures from beginning to end, and then they were all very unhappy. The girls lamented loudly over their lost hopes, and the sons declared their father should not return to the terrible castle, and began to make plans for killing the beast if it should come to fetch him. But he reminded them he had promised to go back. Then the girls were very angry with Beauty and said it was all her fault. If she had asked for something sensible, this would never have happened. Poor Beauty, much distressed, said to them, "I have indeed caused this misfortune, but who could have guessed that to ask for a rose in the middle of summer would cause so much misery? But as I did the mischief, it is only just that I should suffer for it. I will, therefore, go back with my father to keep his promise." At first, nobody would hear of it. Her father and brothers, who loved her dearly, declared nothing should make them let her go. But Beauty was firm. As the time drew near, she divided her little possessions between her sisters and said goodbye to everything she loved. When the fatal day came, she encouraged and cheered her father as they mounted together with the horse which had brought him back. It seemed to fly rather than gallop, but so smoothly that Beauty was not frightened. Indeed, she would have enjoyed the journey if she had not feared what might happen at the end of it. Her father still tried to persuade her to go back, but in vain. While they were talking, the night fell. Then, to their great surprise, wonderful colored lights began to shine in all directions, and splendid fireworks blazed out before them. All the forest was illuminated. They even felt pleasantly warm, though it had been bitterly cold before. They reached the avenue of orange trees and saw that the palace was brilliantly lighted from roof to ground, and music sounded softly from the courtyard. Each of them, she opened the last chest, which was full of gold. "I think, Father," she said, "that, as the gold will be more useful to you, we had better take out the other things again, and fill the trunks with it." So they did this, but the more they put in, the more room there seemed to be, and at last, they put back all the jewels and dresses they had taken out, and Beauty even added as many more of the jewels as she could carry at once. Even then the trunks were not too full, but they were so heavy an elephant could not have carried them. "The beast was mocking us," cried the merchant. "He pretended to give us all these things, knowing that I could not carry them away." "Let us wait and see," answered Beauty. "I cannot believe he meant to deceive us. All we can do is to fasten them up and have them ready." So they did this and returned to the little room where, to their astonishment, they found breakfast ready. The merchant ate him with a good appetite, as the beast's generosity made him believe he might perhaps venture to come back soon and see Beauty. But she felt sure her father was leaving her forever, so she was very sad when the bell rang sharply for the second time and warned them that the time has come for them to part. They went down into the courtyard, where 2 horses were waiting, one loaded with the 2 trunks, the other for him to ride. They were pawing the ground in their impatience to start, and the merchant bade Beauty a hasty farewell. As soon as he was mounted, he went off at such a pace she lost sight of him in an instant. Then Beauty began to cry and wandered sadly back to her own room. But she soon found she was very sleepy, and as she had nothing better to do, she lay down and instantly fell asleep. And then she dreamed she was walking by a brook bordered with trees and lamenting her sad fate, when a young prince, handsomer than anyone she had ever seen, and with a voice that went straight to her heart, came and said to her, "Ah, beauty, you are not so unfortunate as you suppose. Here you will be rewarded for all you have suffered elsewhere. Your every wish shall be gratified. Only try to find me out, no matter how I may be disguised, for I love you dearly, and in making me happy, you will find your own happiness. Be as true-hearted as you are beautiful, and we shall have nothing left to wish for. What can I do, Prince, to make you happy?" said Beauty. "Only be grateful," he answered, "and do not trust too much to your eyes. Above all, do not desert me until you have saved me from my cruel misery." After this she thought she found herself in a room with a stately and beautiful lady, who said to her, "Dear Beauty, try not to regret all you have left behind you. You are destined for a better fate. Only do not let yourself be deceived by appearances." Beauty found her dreams so interesting that she was in no hurry to awake. But presently the clock roused her by calling her name softly 12 times. Then she rose and found her dressing table set out with everything she could possibly want, and when her toilet was finished, she found dinner waiting in the room next to hers. But dinner does not take very long when one is alone, and very soon she sat down cozily in the corner of a sofa and began to think about the charming prince she had seen in her dream. "He said I could make him happy," said Beauty to herself. "It seems, then, that this horrible beast keeps him a prisoner. How can I set him free? I wonder why they both told me not to trust appearances? But after all, it was only a dream, so why should I trouble myself about it? I had better find something to do to amuse myself." So she began to explore some of the many rooms in the palace. The first she entered was lined with mirrors. Beauty saw herself reflected on every side and thought she had never seen such a charming room. Then a bracelet which was hanging from a chandelier caught her eye, and on taking it down, she was greatly surprised to find that it held a portrait of her unknown admirer, just as she had seen him in her dream. With great delight, she slipped the bracelet on her arm and went on into a gallery of pictures, where she soon found a portrait of the same handsome prince, as large as life, and so well painted that as she studied it, he seemed to smile kindly at her. Tearing herself away from the portrait at last, she passed into a room that contained every musical instrument under the sun. And here she amused herself for a long while in trying them and singing until she was tired. The next room was a library, and she saw everything she had ever wanted to read as well as everything she had read. By this time it was growing dusk, and wax candles in diamond and ruby candlesticks lit themselves in every room. Beauty found her supper served just at the time she preferred to have it, but she did not see anyone or hear a sound. Though her father had warned her she would be alone, she began to find it rather dull. Presently she heard the beast coming and wondered tremblingly if he meant to eat her now. However, he did not seem at all ferocious and only said gruffly, "Good evening, Beauty." She answered cheerfully and managed to conceal her terror. The beast asked how she had been amusing herself, and she told him all the rooms she had seen. Then he asked if she thought she could be happy in his palace, and Beauty answered that everything was so beautiful she would be very hard to please if she could not be happy. After about an hour's talk, Beauty began to think the beast was not nearly so terrible as she had supposed at first. Then he rose to leave her and said in his gruff voice, "Do you love me, Beauty? Will you marry me?" "Oh, what shall I say?" cried Beauty, for she was afraid to make the beast angry by refusing. "Say yes or no without fear," he replied. "Oh, no, beast," said Beauty hastily. "Since you will not, good night, Beauty," he said. And she answered, "Good night, beast," very glad to find her refusal had not provoked him. After he was gone, she was very soon in bed and dreaming of her unknown prince. She thought he came and said, ah, Beauty, see what happens when people do not keep their promises. If you had delayed one day more, you would have found him dead." Beauty was so terrified by this dream that the next morning she announced her intention of going back at once. That very evening she said goodbye to her father and her brothers and sisters, and as soon as she was in bed she turned her ring round upon her finger and said firmly, "I wish to go back to my palace and see my beasts again." Beauty and the beast. Then she fell asleep instantly and only woke up to hear the clock saying, "Beauty, Beauty," 12 times in its musical voice, which told her she was really in the palace once more. Everything was just as before, and her birds were so glad to see her, but Beauty thought she had never known such a long day. She was so anxious to see the beast again that she felt as if supper time would never come. But when it came, no beast appeared. After listening and waiting for a long time, she ran down into the garden to search for him. Up and down the paths and avenues ran poor Beauty, calling him. No one answered, and not a trace of him could she find. At last, quite tired, she stopped for a minute's rest and saw that she was standing opposite the shady path she had seen in her dream. She rushed down it and, sure enough, there was the cave, and in it lay the beast, asleep, so Beauty thought. Quite glad to have found him, she ran up and stroked his head, but to her horror, he did not move or open his eyes. "Oh, he is dead, and it is all my fault," cried Beauty, crying bitterly. But then, looking at him again, she fancied he still breathed. Hastily fetching some water from the nearest fountain, she sprinkled it over his face, and to her great delight, he began to revive. "Oh, beast, how you frightened me!" she cried. "I never knew how much I loved you until just now when I feared I was too late to save your life." "Can you really love such an ugly creature as I am?" asked the beast faintly. "Ah, Beauty, you came only just in time. I was dying because I thought you had forgotten your promise. But go back now and rest. I shall see you again by and by." Beauty, who had half expected he would be angry with her, was reassured by his gentle voice and went back to the palace, where supper was awaiting her. And afterward, the beast came in as usual and talked about the time she had spent with her father, asking if she had enjoyed herself and if they had all been glad to see her. Beauty quite enjoyed telling him all that had happened to her. When at last the time came for him to go, he asked, as he had so often asked before, "Beauty, will you marry me?" She answered softly, "Yes, dear beast." As she spoke, a blaze of light sprang up before the windows of the palace. Fireworks crackled and guns banged, and across the avenue of orange trees, in letters all made of fireflies, was written, "Long live the prince and his bride." Turning to ask the beast what it could all mean, Beauty found he had disappeared, and in his place stood her long-loved prince. At the same moment, the wheels of a chariot were heard upon the terrace, and two ladies entered the room. One of them Beauty recognized as the stately lady she had seen in her dreams. The other was so queenly that Beauty hardly knew which to greet Beauty and the beast first. But the one she already knew said to her companion, "Well, Queen, this is Beauty, who has had the courage to rescue your son from the terrible enchantment. They love each other, and only your consent to their marriage is wanting to make them perfectly happy." "I consent with all my heart," cried the queen. "How can I ever thank you enough, charming girl, for having restored my dear son to his natural form?" And then she tenderly embraced Beauty and the prince, who had meanwhile been greeting the fairy and receiving her congratulations. "Now," said the fairy to Beauty, "I suppose you would like me to send for all your brothers and sisters to dance at your wedding?" And so she did. And the marriage was celebrated the very next day with the utmost splendor, and Beauty and the prince lived happily ever after. The end. The Little Mermaid. Far out at sea the water is as blue as the petals of the loveliest cornflower and as clear as the purest glass, but it is very deep, deeper than any anchor cable can reach. Many church towers would have to be placed on top of each other to stretch from the seabed to the surface. Down there the sea folk live. Do not believe, though, that there is nothing but the bare, white sand on the seabed. No, the most marvelous trees and plants grow there that have such pliant trunks, stems and leaves that the slightest movement of the water causes them to move as if they were alive. All the fishes, great and small, slip between their branches, just as birds up here do in the air. At the very deepest spot lies the Sea King's palace. The walls are of coral and the tall pointed windows of the clearest amber. But the roof is of mussel shells that open and close as the water passes. It looks so lovely, for in each of them lie gleaming pearls, a single one of which would be a prized gem in a queen's crown. For many years the Sea King down there had been a widower, but his old mother kept house for him. She was a wise woman, but proud of her high birth. So she always wore 12 oysters on her tail, while all the other fine folk were only allowed to wear 6. Otherwise, she deserved much praise, especially because she was so fond of the small sea princesses, the daughters of her son. There were 6 lovely children, but the youngest one was the most beautiful of them all. Her skin was as clear and delicate as a rose petal, her eyes as blue as the deepest sea. But like the rest of them, she had no feet. Her body ended in a fish's tail. All day long they could spend playing down in the palace, in the great halls where living flowers grew out of the walls. The great amber windows would be opened, and then the fishes would swim into them, just as the swallows fly into us when we open the windows. But the fishes swam right up to the small princesses, ate out of their hand and let themselves be stroked. Outside the palace there was a large garden with bright red and dark blue trees, with fruit that shone like gold and flowers that blazed like fire in the constantly moving stems and leaves. The earth itself was the finest sand, but blue as a flare of sulfur. There lay a mysterious blue sheen over everything down there. It would be easier to believe one was high up in the air and could only see sky above and beneath one than that one was down on the seabed. When the sea was calm, one could make out the sun. It seemed to be a purple flower with its entire light streaming out of the calyx. Each of the small princesses had her own little plot in the garden where she could dig and sow as she wanted. One gave her flower plot the form of a whale, another preferred hers to look like a little mermaid, but the youngest princess made hers completely round like the sun, and only had flowers that shone red like it did. She was a strange child, quiet and thoughtful, and while the other sisters added the most remarkable things they had taken from stranded ships as decoration, all she wanted to have, apart from the rose-red flowers that resembled the sun high up above, was a beautiful marble statue. It was of a fine-looking lad, carved out of clear white stone and left on the seabed after a ship had foundered. At its base she planted a rose-red weeping willow. It grew splendidly and hung with its fresh branches over the statue, down towards the blue seabed, where its shadow appeared to be violet and in motion, just like the branches. It looked as if the tree top and its roots pretended to be kissing each other. Nothing made her happier than to hear about the human world above them. The old grandmother had to tell all she knew about ships and cities, people and animals, and what seemed especially delightful to her was that up on the earth the flowers had a scent. for they did not down on the seabed, and that the forests were green, and the fish that could be seen among their branches could sing too so loudly and sweetly that it gladdened the heart. It was the small birds that grandmother called fish, for otherwise the sisters would not be able to understand her, as they had never seen a bird. When you complete your 15th year, grandmother said, you will be allowed to rise up out of the sea, sit in the moonlight on the rocks, and watch the big ships that sail past. You will see forests and cities. During the following year, one of the sisters turned 15, but the others, well, each one was a year younger than the other, so the youngest had no less than 5 years to wait before she would venture to come up from the seabed and see how things are in our world. But each one promised the other to relate what she had seen and found most delightful on that first day, for their grandmother did not tell them enough. There was so much they wanted to know about. None was as full of longing as the youngest one, the very princess who had the longest time to wait and who was so quiet and thoughtful. Many a night she would stand at the open window and gaze up through the dark blue water, where the fishes swished their fins and tails. She could see the moon and the stars. Their gleam was admittedly somewhat pale, but through the water they looked much larger than they do to our eyes. If what looked like a black cloud passed beneath them, she knew that it was either a whale swimming above her, or possibly a ship with many people on board. They certainly didn't think there might be a lovely little mermaid standing below them, stretching her white hands up towards the keel. Now the oldest princess was 15 years old and was to venture above the surface of the sea. When she came back, she had hundreds of things to tell, but the most delightful, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on a sandbank in the calm water, and to see close to the coast the great city, where the lights twinkled like hundreds of stars, to hear the music and the noise and clamor of carriages and humans, see the many church towers and spires, and to hear the bells ringing out. Precisely because she could not come up there, she longed most of all for all this. Oh, how the youngest sister was all ears, and when later that evening she stood by the open window and gazed up through the dark blue water, she thought of the great city with all its noise and clamor, and she believed she could hear the church bells sounding down where she was. The following year the second sister was allowed to rise through the water and swim wherever she wanted. She swam up just as the sun was setting, and it was that sight which she felt was the loveliest. The whole sky had looked as if it was of gold, she said, and the clouds, well, their loveliness she could not describe enough. Red and yellow, they had sailed over her head, but far swifter than them, like a long wild veil, a flock of wild swans had flown over the water where the sun stood. She swam towards it, but it sank and the rosy gleam on the surface of the sea and the clouds was extinguished. The following year a third sister came up there. She was the boldest of them all, so she swam up a broad estuary that flowed into the sea. She saw lovely green slopes with vines, castles and manors peeped out between magnificent forests. She heard how all the birds sang and the sun shone so strongly that she often had to dive down under the surface to cool her burning face. In a small bay she met a whole flock of small human children. Completely naked, they ran about and splashed in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they ran away in fear, and a small black animal appeared. It was a dog. But she had never seen a dog before. It barked so terribly at her that she was scared and made for the open sea. But she could never forget the magnificent forests, the green hillsides and the charming children who could swim on the water, even though they didn't have any tail. The fourth sister was not as bold. She stayed out in the wild mid-ocean, and said that it was precisely this that was the loveliest. One could see many miles around one on all sides. And the sky above was like a great bell jar. She had seen ships, but far off, they looked like gulls. The amusing dolphins had turned somersaults, and the huge whales had spouted water up out of their blowholes. So it had looked like hundreds of fountains around her. It was now the fifth sister's turn. Her birthday happened to be in the winter, and so she saw what the others had not seen on their first visit. The water looked quite green and great icebergs were swimming around in it. Each of them looked like a pearl, she said, and yet they were far bigger than the church towers humans built. They appeared in the most remarkable shapes and glittered like diamonds. She had sat down on one of the largest, and all the sailing ships, in fright, gave her a wide berth, where she sat letting the wind play with her long hair. But later in the evening the sky became overcast. There was thunder and lightning, while the Black Sea lifted the great blocks of ice high up and let them gleam in the red lightning. The sails were taken in on all the ships, and they were in fear and dread, but she calmly sat on her swimming iceberg and watched the blue stroke of lightning zigzag down into the gleaming sea. The first time any of the sisters came above the surface of the water, each of them was always fascinated by the new, beautiful things she saw. But since they now, as grown-up girls, were allowed to go up there whenever they wanted, things lost their appeal. They longed to be back home. And after a month they said that it was most beautiful of all down where they lived, and so nice to be home. On many an evening the five sisters interlocked arms and rose in a row above the water. They had beautiful voices, more beautiful than any humans, and when a storm blew up, so that they thought the ships were bound to go under, they would swim in front of the ships and sing so beautifully of how delightful it was on the seabed, and tell the sailors not to be frightened of coming down there. But the sailors were unable to understand the words and thought it was the storm, nor did they ever get to see any of these delights, for when their ship sank, those on board drowned, and only came down to the Sea King's palace as corpses. When the sisters gathered in the evening, arm in arm, and ascended through the sea, their little sister was thus left behind all on her own, and it was as if she would cry. But a mermaid has no tears, and so she had to suffer all the more. "Ah, if only I was 15 years old," she said, I know that I will grow really fond of the world above us and of the people who build and live up there." At last, she reached the age of 15. "There, now we've got you off our hands," her grandmother, the old Queen Mother, said. "Come here, let me deck you out like your other sisters." And she placed a garland of white lilies in her hair, but each petal in the flower was half a pearl. And the old lady had 8 large oysters attach themselves to the princess's tail to indicate her high rank. "It hurts so much," the little mermaid said. "Yes, one has to go through a great deal of trouble to look nice," the old woman said. Oh, she would so much have liked to shake all this finery off her and laid the heavy garland aside. Her red flowers in the garden suited her much better, but she didn't dare rearrange things. "Goodbye," she said, and rose so light and clear, like a bubble through the water. The sun had just set as she lifted her head above the surface of the water, but all the clouds were still gleaming like roses and gold. And in the midst of the pale red sky the evening star shone with such brightness and beauty. The air was mild and fresh, and the sea absolutely still. On it was a large ship with 3 masts, with only a single sail up, for there was not a breath of wind, and here and there in the ropes and on the beams the sailors were sitting. There was music and singing, and as the evening grew darker, hundreds of many-colored lamps were lit, so it looked as if the flags of every nation were waving in the wind. The little mermaid swam right up to the cabin window, and each time the swell lifted her up, she could look through the mirror-clear windows where the many people stood in fine array. But the handsome, even so was the young prince with the large black eyes. He couldn't have been much older than 16, it was his birthday, which was why there was so much of a to-do. The sailors were dancing on deck, and when the young prince came out, more than 100 rockets shot up into the air. They lit everything up as if it was broad daylight. So the little mermaid was very frightened and dived under the surface, but soon she stuck her head up again, and then it was as if all the stars in the sky fell down to her. She had never seen such pyrotechnics before. Great suns span round, wonderful fire fishes soared into the blue sky, and everything was reflected by the clear, calm sea. On board the ship everything was so bright that one could see every little rope, and the people too. Oh, how handsome the young prince was, and he clasped people's hands, laughed and smiled, while the music rang out in the wonderful evening. It grew late, but the little mermaid was unable to take her eyes off the ship and the handsome prince. The many-colored lamps were put out, no more rockets soared into the sky, there were no more cannon shots, but deep down in the sea there was a humming and droning. Whereas she sat on the surface rocking up and down, so that she could look into the cabin. But the ship picked up speed, one sail after the other unfurled. Now the waves became stronger, large clouds appeared, and there was lightning in the distance. Oh, there was going to be a terrible storm. So the sailors reefed in the sails, and the large ship careered along at great speed on the wild waves, The water rose to form what looked like great black mountains that would crash down over the mast. But the ship dipped like a swan down between the high waves and let itself be lifted up on the towering waters. The Little Mermaid found this ride enjoyable, but the sailors did not. The ship creaked and groaned, the thick planking bent at the buffeting of the waves, the mast broke in two as if it was a reed, and the ship rolled over on its side and water began to pour in. Now the Little Mermaid realized that they were in danger. She had to take care herself to avoid the beams and fragments of the ship that were floating on the water. At one moment it was so pitch black that she couldn't see the slightest thing, but when a flash of lightning came, everything was so clear once more that she could make out all of them on the ship. Everyone lurched around as best he could. She looked especially for the young prince, and when the ship came apart, she saw him sink down into the depths of the ocean. To begin with, she was quite pleased, for now he would be coming down to her, but then she remembered that humans cannot live in the water, and that he would not come down to her father's palace. Only his corpse. No, he could not be allowed to die. So she swam in among the beams and planks that drifted on the sea, completely forgot that they might have crushed her. She dived deep beneath the surface and rose up high again between the waves. And finally she managed to reach the young prince, who was hardly able to swim any longer in the stormy sea. His arms and legs were beginning to go limp. His beautiful eyes too close. He would have died if the Little Mermaid had not come to his aid. She held his head above water, and then let the waves bear her and him wherever they wanted. When morning came, the bad weather was over. Not a shred of the ship was to be seen. The sun rose red and gleaming out of the water. It was as if this brought life to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his lovely high forehead and stroked back his wet hair. To her he looked like the marble statue down in her little garden. She kissed him again, and wished for him to be allowed to live. She now saw the mainland ahead of her. Tall blue mountains with white snow gleaming on their summits as if swans were lying there. Down by the coast there were lovely green forests, and in front of them lay a church or an abbey. She did not know for sure, but it was definitely a building. Lemon and orange trees grew in the garden, and in front of the gate stood tall palm trees. The shore formed a small bay here where the water was completely still but very deep, all the way to the cliff where fine silver sand had been washed up. She swam over there with the handsome prince and laid him down on the sand, but made sure that his head lay high up in the warm sunshine. Now the bells in the large white building started to chime, and many young girls came walking through the garden. Then the Little Mermaid swam further out behind some boulders that stuck up out of the water, placed sea foam of her hair and breast so that no one could see her small face. And then she watched to see who came out to the poor prince. It did not take long before a young girl came to the spot. She seemed to be quite shocked, but only for a moment. Then she fetched some others. And the mermaid saw how the prince recovered and that he smiled to all of those around him, but not out to her, for he did not even know that she had saved him. She felt so sad, and when he was led into the large building, she dived sorrowfully down into the water and sought her way home to her father's palace. She had always been quiet and thoughtful, but now she was even more so. Her sisters asked her what she had seen the first time up above, but she did not tell them anything. Many an evening and morning she rose up to the spot where she had left the prince. She saw how the fruit in the garden ripened and was picked. She saw how the snow melted on the high mountains, but she did not see the prince. And therefore she was always even sadder when she returned home. Her only consolation was to sit in her little garden and embrace the beautiful marble statue that looked like the prince. But she did not tend her flowers, they grew as in a wilderness, out over the paths and twined their long stems and leaves in among the branches so that it became quite dark. Finally, she couldn't bear it any longer, and told one of her sisters, and soon all of them had got to hear of it. But only her other sisters and a couple of other mermaids, who only told their closest friends. One of them knew the identity of the prince. She had also seen the festivities on the ship, knew where he came from, and where his kingdom lay. "Come, little sister," the other princesses said. And with their arms round each other's shoulders they rose in a long row out of the sea in front of the place where they knew the prince's palace lay. It had been built of a light yellow gleaming type of stone, with large marble staircases. One went straight down to the sea. Magnificent gilt domes rose up above the roof, and between the columns that went round the entire building there were marble statues that looked as if they were alive. Through the clear glass in the tall windows one could glimpse the most magnificent halls that were hung with precious silk curtains and tapestries. And all the walls were adorned with large paintings that were a sheer joy to look at. In the middle of the largest hall there was a large plashing fountain, its jets shooting up towards the glass dome in the ceiling, through which the sun shone on the water and on the lovely plants growing in the large pool. Now she knew where he lived, and she went there many an evening and night on the water. She swam much closer to the land than any of the others had dared. She even went right up into the narrow canal, under the magnificent marble balcony that cast a long shadow over the water. Here she sat and gazed at the young prince, who thought he was completely alone in the bright moonlight. Many evenings she saw him sail about with music in his magnificent boat with its fluttering flags. She peeped out through the green rushes, and if the wind caught her silver-white veil and anyone saw it, they thought it was a swan lifting its wings. Many a night, when the fishermen were out at sea with their blazing torches, she heard them say many good things about the young prince. And it pleased her that she had saved his life when he was drifting half dead on the waves, and she thought of how firmly his head had rested on her breast, and how fervently she had kissed him then. He knew nothing about that, couldn't even dream about her. She came to like human beings more and more, and she wished more and more to be able to rise up among them. Their world seemed to her to be much bigger than hers, for they could fly across the ocean on ships, climb high mountains way above the clouds, and the countries they owned stretched with their forests and fields farther than the eye could see. There was so much she wanted to know, but her sisters could not answer everything, so she asked her old grandmother, and she was familiar with the higher world, which is what she rightly called the lands above the sea. When humans do not drown, the Little Mermaid asked, can they stay alive forever? Don't they die like we do down here in the sea? 6. Oh yes, the old woman said, they too have to die. And their lives are even shorter than ours are. We can live until we are 300 years old, but when we cease to exist, we become foam on the water, do not even have a grave down here among our dear ones. We do not have an immortal soul, we will never live again, we are like the green rushes. Once they have been severed they can never grow green again. Humans on the other hand have a soul that lives forever, lives even after the body has become earth. It rises up through the clear sky up to all the shining stars. Just as we rise up to the surface of the sea and see the lands of the humans, they rise up to unknown lovely places, those we will never get to see. Why did we never get an immortal soul? The Little Mermaid asked sadly. I would give up all the 300 years I have to live in just to be a human being for one day and then be part of the heavenly world. You mustn't spend your time thinking of such things. The old woman said, we have a much happier and better life than the human beings up there. So I am to die and float like foam on the sea, not hear the music of the waves, see the lovely flowers and the red sun. Is there nothing I can do to gain an eternal soul? No, the old woman said, only if a human were to fall so in love with you that you were more to him than his father and mother. If all his thoughts and love were centered on you, and he would let the priest place his right hand in yours and promise to be faithful now and in all eternity. Only then would his soul flow over into your body and you would partake in human happiness. He would give you a soul and yet retain his own. But that can never happen. For what is so lovely here in the ocean, your fish's tail, they find ugly up there on the earth, they don't understand it at all. There one has to have two clumsy props that they call legs in order to be considered beautiful or handsome. Then the Little Mermaid sighed and looked sadly at her fish's tail. Let's be content, the old woman said, let's jump and leap in the 300 years we have to live in, that's quite a long time after all. And then one can even more contentedly rest in one's grave. This evening there is to be court ball. It was also more magnificent than anything ever seen on earth. The walls and ceiling of the great dance hall were of thick but clear glass. Several hundred huge mussel shells, rosy red and green as grass, stood in rows on either side with a blue burning fire that lit up the entire hall and gleamed out through the walls so that the sea right outside looked quite illuminated. One could see all the innumerable fish, great and small, that swam towards the glass wall. On some of them the scales gleamed a purple red, on others they seemed to be silver and gold. A broadly running stream ran through the middle of the hall, and on it mermen and mermaids danced to their own delightful singing. The humans on Earth do not have such beautiful voices. The Little Mermaid sang the most beautifully of them all, and they applauded her, and for a moment she felt happy in her heart. For she knew that she had the loveliest voice of anyone on Earth and in the sea. But soon she began to think once more of the world above her. She couldn't forget the handsome prince and her sorrow at not owning, as he did, an immortal soul. So she slipped away from her father's palace, and while everything was singing and enjoyment inside, she sat out in her own little garden and was sad. Then she heard French horns sounding down through the water, and she thought, now he is out sailing, the one who I love even more than father and mother. The one who fills all my thoughts, and in whose hand I wish to place all my life's happiness. I will risk anything to win him and an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing inside my father's palace, I will go to the sea witch. I've always been so afraid of her. But she can perhaps advise and help me. Now the Little Mermaid left her garden and went towards the roaring whirlpools behind which the witch lived. She had never gone that way before. No flowers grew there, no sea grass, only the bare gray sandy bottom stretched towards the whirlpools, where the water, like roaring mill wheels, 7 whirled round and tore everything they caught hold of down with it into the depths. She had to pass between these crushing, whirling masses of water to get to the region of the sea witch, and here there was for quite some distance no other way than over the hot, bubbling mud the witch called her peat bog. Behind it lay her house in the middle of a strange forest. All the trees and shrubs were polyps, half animal and half plant. They looked like snakes with hundreds of heads growing out of the earth. All the branches were long, slimy arms, with fingers like pliant worms, and joint by joint they moved from the root to the outermost tip. Everything in the sea they could catch hold of they twined round tightly and never let go again. The Little Mermaid remained standing quite terrified outside there. Her heart pounded with fear. She had almost turned back, but then she thought of the prince and of the human soul, and that gave her courage. She bound her long, fluttering hair around her head so that the polyps couldn't grab hold of it, folded both her hands over her breast, and flew, as fish can fly through the water, in among the horrible polyps which stretched out their pliant arms and fingers after her. She saw that wherever they had seized something, hundreds of small arms held it as with bands of steel. Humans who had perished at sea and sunk down to the depths, peeped out from the polyps' arms as white skeletons. They held onto ships' rudders and chests, skeletons of land animals and a little mermaid that they had caught and strangled, that was what seemed to her to be almost the most dreadful. She now came to a large slimy place in the forest where large, fat water snakes tumbled and showed their vile white-yellow bellies. In the middle of this clearing a house had been built of the white bones of shipwrecked human beings. There the sea witch sat, allowing a toad to eat from her mouth, just as humans allow a small canary to eat sugar. The horrible fat water snakes she called her small chickens, and she let them romp around on her large, spongy breast. "I know what you want, all right," the sea witch said. "It's very stupid of you. But you shall have your will even so, for it will bring you great misfortune, my lovely princess. You want to get rid of your fish's tail and have two props instead to go around on just like human beings, so that the young prince can fall in love with you and you can have him and an immortal soul." And just then the witch cackled so loudly and horribly that the toad and the grass snakes fell to the ground and tossed around there. "You've come at precisely the right time," the witch said. "Tomorrow when the sun rises I couldn't have helped you before another year had passed. I will prepare a drink for you. Before the sun rises you must swim with it to where there is land, sit down on the shore there and drink it, then your tail will split and contract into what humans call a nice pair of legs. But it will hurt you, it is as if a sharp sword passed through you. Everyone who sees you will say you are the loveliest human child they have ever seen. You will keep your floating walk, no dancer can float as you can, but each step you take will be like treading on a sharp knife that made your blood flow. Are you prepared to suffer all this? For then I will help you." "Yes," the little mermaid said with a trembling voice, and she thought of the prince and of winning an immortal soul. "But remember this," the witch said, "once you have assumed human form, you can never become a mermaid again. You can never dive down through the water to your sisters and to your father's palace, and if you do not gain the love of the prince, so that he forgets his father and mother for you, unless you fill all his thoughts and he lets the priest place your hands in each other's so that you become man and wife, you will not gain an immortal soul. The first morning after he has married someone else, your heart will break, and you will become foam on the water. This is my wish." The little mermaid said and was deathly pale. "But you must also pay me," the witch said, "and what I am asking for is no trifle. You have the loveliest voice of all those here on the seabed, and you count on entrancing him with it, but that voice you must give to me. I must have the best thing you own for my precious drink. I must give you of my own blood for the drink, so that it can be as sharp as a double-edged sword." But if you take my voice," the little mermaid said, "what am I left with?" "Your beautiful appearance," the witch said, "your floating walk and your eloquent eyes. With those you're sure to be able to captivate a human heart. Well, have you lost your courage? Stretch out your little tongue, I will cut it off as payment, and you shall have your powerful drink." "So be it," the little mermaid said. and the witch fetched her cauldron to boil the magic potion. "Cleanliness is next to godliness," she said, and scoured the inside of it with the grass snakes, which she bound into a knot. Now she made a deep scratch in her breast and let her black blood drip down in it. The steam formed the queerest shapes that were scaring and frightening. Every second the witch added new things to the cauldron, and when it boiled away it was as if a crocodile was crying. Finally the drink was ready. It looked like the clearest water. "There it is," the witch said, and cut the Little Mermaid's tongue off. She was mute now, unable to either sing or speak. "If the polyps should seize you as you pass through my forest on your way back," the witch said, "just throw a single drop of this drink onto them and their arms and fingers will burst into thousands of pieces." But the mermaid had no need of this. The polyps retreated in fear when they saw she was carrying the gleaming drink that shone in her hand as if it was a twinkling star. So she soon came through the forest, the bog and the roaring whirlpools. She could see her father's palace. The lamps had been put out in the large dance hall. They were surely all asleep inside, but she did not dare to try and find them, now that she could not speak and would be leaving them forever. It felt as if her heart would break from sorrow. She stole into the garden, took one flower from each of her sister's flower beds, sent thousands of finger kisses towards the palace, and rose up through the dark blue waters. The sun had not yet appeared when she saw the prince's palace and went up the magnificent marble staircase. The moon shone wonderfully clearly. The Little Mermaid downed the fiery, sharp drink, and it was as though a two-edged sword went right through her fine body. She fainted and lay as if dead. When the sun was shining over the sea, she woke up and felt a searing pain, but right in front of her the handsome young prince was standing. He fixed his jet-black eyes on her. So she lowered hers and saw that her fish's tail was gone and that she had the most attractive small white legs any young girl could have, but she was completely naked. So she wrapped herself in her long tresses. The prince asked who she was, and how she had come to be there, and she looked at him so gently and so sorrowfully with her dark blue eyes, for she could not speak, you see. Then he took her by the hand and led her into the palace. Every step she took was, as the witch had said to her earlier, as if she was treading on pointed needles and sharp knives, but she put up with this gladly. With the prince's hand holding hers, she rose as light as a soap bubble, and he and everyone else marveled at her elegant, floating walk. She was dressed in priceless clothes of silk and muslin. She was the most beautiful of all those at the palace, but she was mute, unable to sing or speak. Lovely slave girls, dressed in silk and gold, came forward and sang for the prince and his royal parents. A song more beautiful than all the others, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. Then the Little Mermaid felt sad, for she knew that she herself would have sung far more beautifully. She thought, oh, if only he knew that in order to be with him I have given away my voice for all eternity. Now the slave girls danced graceful, floating dances to the loveliest music. Then the little mermaid lifted her beautiful white arms, raised herself on tiptoe and floated across the floor, danced as no one had ever danced before. At her every movement her loveliness became more apparent, and her eyes spoke more profoundly to the heart than the singing of the slave girls. Everyone was enchanted by this, particularly the prince, who called her his little foundling. And she danced more and more, even though every time her foot touched the ground it was as if she was 9 treading on sharp knives. The prince said that she was to be with him always, and she was allowed to sleep outside his door on a velvet cushion. He had a man's costume sewn for her, so that she could follow him on horseback. They rode through the fragrant forests where the green branches brushed her shoulders and the small birds sang behind fresh green leaves. She climbed with the prince on the high mountains, and although her fine feet bled, so that the others noticed it, she merely laughed at this and followed him until they saw the clouds sailing beneath them as if they were a flock of birds flying off to foreign lands. Back at the prince's palace, when the others were asleep, she went out onto the broad marble staircase, and it cooled her burning feet to stand there in the cold sea water. And then she thought of them down there in the depths of the ocean. One night her sisters came arm in arm. They sang so sorrowfully as they swam across the water, and she waved to them, and they recognized her and told her how sad she had made them all. Every night after that they visited her, and one night, far out, she saw her old grandmother, who had not been up to the surface of the sea for many years. And the Sea King with his crown on his head. They stretched their arms out towards her, but did not dare come as close to the shore as her sisters did. Day by day the prince became more dear to her. He was fond of her as one can be fond of a good, dear child, but it never occurred to him to make her his queen, and she had to become his wife. Otherwise she would never get an immortal soul, but on his wedding morning would become foam on the sea. Aren't you fonder of me than all the rest? The eyes of the little mermaid seemed to say when he took her in his arms and kissed her lovely forehead. Yes, you are dearest of all to me, the prince said, for you have the best heart of them all, you are the most devoted to me. And you resemble a young girl I once saw but will surely never find again. I was on a ship that was wrecked. The waves washed me ashore near a sacred temple where several young girls were in service. The youngest of them found me down on the shore and saved my life. I only saw her twice. She was the only one I could ever love in this world. But you resemble her, you almost replace her image in my soul. She belongs to the holy temple. And therefore my good fortune has sent you to me. We shall never be parted. Alas, he doesn't know that I have saved his life. The little mermaid thought. I carried him over the sea to the forest where the temple stands. I sat behind the foam and waited to see if anyone would come. I saw the beautiful girl he is more fond of than me. And the mermaid sighed deeply. She was unable to cry. The girl belongs to the sacred temple, he has told me. She will never come out into the world. They will not meet again. I am with him. I see him every day. I will take care of him, love him, sacrifice my life to him. But now the prince is to be married and have the lovely daughter of the king of the neighboring country. People said, that is why he is equipping a ship so magnificently. The prince is traveling to see the lands of the neighboring king, is the official explanation, but it is to see the neighboring king's daughter. He is to have a large retinue with him. But the little mermaid shook her head and laughed. She knew the prince's thoughts much better than all the rest. I must travel, he had said to her. I must see the beautiful princess. My parents insist on it, but they do not wish to force me to bring her home as my bride. I cannot love her. She does not look like the beautiful girl in the temple that you resemble. If I ever had to choose a bride, it would rather be you, my speechless foundling with the eloquent eyes. And he kissed her red lips, played with her long tresses, and placed his head close to her heart, so it dreamed of human happiness and an immortal soul. But you are not frightened of the sea, my mute child, he said when they stood on board the magnificent ship that was to take him to the lands of the neighboring king. And he told her about storms and dead calms, about strange fish in the ocean depths and what the diver had seen there, and she smiled at his account. For she of course knew far better than anyone else about the seabed. 10 in the moonlit night, when everyone was asleep, except for the maid, she sat by the railing of the ship and stared down through the clear water, and she seemed to see her father's palace. Highest up stood her old grandmother with her silver crown on her head and stared up through the swift currents at the keel of the ship. Then her sisters broke the surface of the sea. They stared sorrowfully at her and wrung their white hands. She waved to them, smiled and wanted to tell them that things were going well and successfully for her, but the ship's buoy came closer and the sisters dived down. So he thought that what he had seen had merely been white foam on the water. The next morning the ship entered the harbor of the magnificent city of the neighboring king. All the church bells rang out, and trumpets sounded from the high towers, while the soldiers stood with fluttering flags and glinting bayonets. There were festivities every single day, balls and parties in succession, but the princess was not present yet. She was being brought up far away from there in a sacred temple, they said, where she was learning all the royal virtues. Finally, she arrived on the scene. The little mermaid was most eager to see her beauty, and she had to admit, never seen a fairer creature. Her skin was so fine and transparent, and behind the long, dark eyelashes there smiled a pair of black-blue faithful eyes. "It's you," the prince said, "you who saved me when I lay like a corpse on the shore." And he embraced his blushing bride. "Oh, I am far too fortunate," he said to the little mermaid. "The best thing I could ever have hoped for has been fulfilled for me. You will rejoice in my good fortune, for you are more fond of me than all the others." And the little mermaid kissed his hand, and she seemed to feel her heart break. His wedding morning would bring her death and turn her into foam on the sea. All the church bells rang out, the heralds rode through the streets and announced the engagement. Fragrant oil burned in precious silver lamps on all the altars. The priests swung incense and the bride and bridegroom joined hands and received the bishop's blessing. The little mermaid stood in silk and gold and held the bride's train, but her ear did not hear the festive music, her eye did not see the holy ceremony, she thought only of her death night, of all that she had lost in this world. That very same evening, the bride and bridegroom boarded the ship, the cannons were fired, all the flags waved, and a fine tent of gold and purple had been raised in the middle of the ship. With the loveliest of cushions, there the wedding couple were to sleep in the still, cool night. The sails swelled out in the wind, and the ship glided lightly and without any great motion out across the clear water. When it grew dark, many colored lamps were lit and the sailors danced merry dances on deck. The little mermaid had to think of the first time she surfaced from the depths and saw the same magnificence and happiness, and she whirled round in the dance too. Floated like the swallow floats when it is being pursued, and everyone expressed their great admiration. Never had she danced so wonderfully. It felt like sharp knives in her fine small feet, but she did not notice it. It was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. She knew this would be the last evening she would see the man for whom she had abandoned her home and her family, given up her lovely voice, and suffered endless torment every day, without him having any idea of this. This was the last night she would breathe the same air as he did, see the deep ocean and the star-studded sky. An eternal night without thought or dream awaited her. She who had no soul and would never be able to gain one. And there was joy and merriment on board until way after midnight. She laughed and danced but with the thought of death in her heart. The prince kissed his lovely bride, and she played with his black hair, and arm in arm they retired to the magnificent tent. It grew quiet and still on board, with only the mate still on duty. The little mermaid laid her white arm on the railing and looked eastwards towards the approaching dawn, the first rays of the sun. She even knew would kill her. Then she saw her sisters rise up out of the sea. They were pale, as she was. Their long beautiful hair no longer fluttered in the wind, it had been cut off. We have given it to the witch, so that she can bring help and prevent you from dying this night. She has given us a knife, here it is. Can you see how sharp it is? Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the prince's heart, and when his warm blood spatters onto your feet, they will once more become a fish's tail, and you will become a mermaid once again. Be able to come down into the water to us and live your 300 years before you are turned into dead, salty sea foam. Hurry! Either he or you must die before the sun rises. Our old grandmother is grieving so much that her white hair has fallen off, just as ours did at the witch's scissors. Kill the prince and come back. Hurry, Can't you see the red streak in the sky? In a few minutes the sun will rise and you will have to die." And they let out a strangely deep sigh and sank down into the waves. The little mermaid pulled by the purple curtain from the tent, and she saw the lovely bride sleeping with her head on the prince's breast, and she bent down, kissed him on his handsome forehead, looked up at the sky where the dawn grew stronger and stronger, looked down at the sharp knife, and once more fixed her eyes on the prince, who named his bride by name in his dreams. She alone was in his thoughts, and the knife shook in the mermaid's hand, but then she flung it far out across the waves, which gleamed red when it fell. So it looked like drops of blood trickling up out of the water. Once more she gazed at the prince with half-glazed eyes, rushed off the ship down into the sea, and felt her body dissolve into foam. Now the sun rose out of the sea. Its rays fell so gently and warmly on the deathly cold sea foam, and the little mermaid did not feel death. She saw the bright sun, and up above her there floated hundreds of transparent, lovely creatures. Through them she could see the ship's white sails and the sky's red clouds. Their voice was a melody, but so spiritual that no human ear could hear it. Just as no earthly eye could see them, without wings they floated in their own lightness through the air. "Who am I coming to?" she said, and her voice sounded like those of the other beings, so spiritual that no earthly music can reproduce it. "To the daughters of the air," the others replied. "A mermaid has no immortal soul, can never gain one unless she wins the love of a human being. Her eternal being depends on a foreign force. The daughters of the air do not have an eternal soul either, but by good deeds they are able to create one for themselves. We fly to the warm countries where the sultry plague air kills people. There we fan cool air on them. We spread the scent of flowers through the air and send refreshment and cure. When we have striven to do all the good we can for 300 years, we are granted an immortal soul and take part in the eternal happiness of humans. You, poor little mermaid, have striven to do the same with all your heart as we do. You have suffered and endured, have lifted yourself up to the realm of the spirits of the air. Now through good deeds you can create for yourself an immortal soul in 300 years' time." And the little mermaid lifted her clear arms towards God's Son. And for the first time she felt tears. On board the ship there was noise and life once more. She saw the prince with his lovely bride searching for her. Sadly they stared at the bubbling foam, as if they knew she had thrown herself into the waves. Unseen, she kissed the bride's forehead, smiled at him and rose with the other children of the air up onto the rosy cloud that sailed through the sky. In 300 years' time we will sail thus into the kingdom of God. We can also enter in earlier than that. One of them whispered. We can float unseen into the homes of humans who have children, and each time we find a good child that gladdens its parents and earns their love, God shortens our time of probation. The child is unaware of us flying through the living room, And when we smile with joy at it, 1 year is taken away from our 300. But if we see a naughty and wicked child, then we have to cry tears of sorrow, and each tear adds a further day to our time of probation. The end.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment down below, let us know what topic do you want to learn. See you next time.